Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Treasury Select Committee hearing on the work of Hmrc. We have three witnesses before us this afternoon. I'm going to ask them to very briefly introduce themselves to the committee, starting please with Jim.
Jim Harra, First Permanent Secretary and Chief Executive of Hmrc.
Welcome, Jim. And Penny, please.
I'm Penny Janevich. I'm the Director General for Customer Compliance in Hmrc.
And Angela, please.
Hi, I'm Angela MacDonald. I'm the Second Permanent Secretary and Deputy Chief Executive.
Great. Well, welcome. Thank you very much for appearing before us. Perhaps I can start, Jim, with yourself and go straight to error and fraud around the coronavirus support measures. Just let me walk through the numbers, just so that the committee is very clear as to what that we've got the right figures. As I understand it, the total amount of support, this is across furlough, SEISS and eatout to help out, was 81.2 billion. Of that, furlough was 60.7 billion, and you were expecting originally, I think, between 5 and 10% of that to be E and F, or E or F. And it's now currently penciled in at 8.7%, so it's within that range. SEISS was 19.7 billion of the total, with 1 to 2% expected to be error and fraud, and you're now expecting about 2.5%, so outside of that range, which we might come back to. Eatout to help out 840 million, 5 to 10% expected, and about 8.5% now expected. And if you total up the total of error and fraud on your current expectation, it's about 6 billion. And I think I'm right in saying you're expecting to bring in about £1 out of every 4 of that, meaning that there would be a loss expected overall of about 4.3 billion across those three support measures. Is that an accurate understanding?
So I think that's pretty close. I think an update on what our expectations are, however, in terms of recoveries of error and fraud. So in the 2020-2021 financial year, we recovered £536 million from our post-payment enforcement action. In addition, we recovered £350 million when we prompted employers to double-check and correct their
Are we talking about across all three support measures there, or is that just furlough?
No, I think this is across all three, although the 350 million relates solely to furlough. So we prompted employers to check their own claims, and they corrected and returned 350 million to us. And then over the course of this financial year and the next one, we expect to recover about £1 billion with the additional funding that we've been given. But beyond that, we're not giving up on this. We are continuing to seek to recover everything we can. So, we don't recognise any claims that we have written off any money. We definitely have not, and we don't intend to do so. So I think that net figure will be lower than you've quoted.
Where would that leave us then, if you get the billion, and as you say, you've already got 536 and 350? Does that take that 4.3 down to?
Currently, what we've currently achieved and what we expect to achieve this year, next year, you're approaching £2 billion of recoveries. And as I say, first of all, we intend to try and beat that if we possibly can, but also beyond the next 2 years, we're not giving up on that at all.
Yeah, I understand. But that would mean that if those figures are met, the ones you suggested, the billion, etc., and that which you've already brought in, you'd still be left with about, £2.5 billion?
To chase, yeah.
Roughly to chase. Okay. Now, let's just focus on that, because there is this distinction between saying, well, it's at risk and we're going to chase it, and whether we get it in or not. Are you sitting there thinking, well, actually, we might get quite a lot of that £2.5 billion in, because it is a large amount of money?
I think we have made a realistic forecast of the amount that we expect to get in with the additional resources that we've been given. Obviously, as time goes on, it becomes more challenging. I think there's two challenges to this. One is the nature of the error and fraud. We believe that the controls that we put in place were very effective in preventing criminal attack. So what we're not talking about here is money in the hands of criminals that we are chasing, because we largely were able to prevent that. What we're talking about is overclaims by real employers and self-employed people, often fairly small amounts, case by case, and often quite difficult for us to establish. So whilst we've estimated that global amount, that doesn't mean that we can just issue the bills to people, because we don't know who they are and we haven't demonstrated case by case the non-compliance. And some of that non-compliance, I think, would be very difficult to actually determine and prove, even though we believe it may be in there spread across that population.
So from what you're saying, Jim, I think what you're saying is there's this 2.5 billion, which you haven't given up on, absolutely, and perhaps you'll never give up on it, but the reality is that there's not a high expectation or any real expectation that that money is going to be retrieved. Would that be? I
certainly think it would not be realistic for me to say that we expect to collect all of that, or even to find all of it in that population.
Okay. Are you satisfied with that figure of $2.5 billion? A lot of people feel that's a very large amount of money, and notwithstanding the point that you may be about to make about having to get the money out quickly, and therefore you were always going to get some error and fraud associated with it. Is that an acceptable outcome?
I don't think any error and fraud is acceptable, and hence why we won't give up on any of it. It is not acceptable that people make incorrect claims, but I do think it was inevitable. I think when I
at that level, it was inevitable.
Yes, I mean, I think when I appeared before this committee in April 2020, just after we launched the schemes, I think I did say our expectation was that error and fraud in the furlough scheme, for example, would be in that 5 to 10% range, and that is, I think, there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, whilst we had to build in as many controls as we possibly could to prevent error and fraud, we could not do so to an extent that would then have prevented the scheme from achieving its objectives, which obviously was to get help to people to protect jobs and businesses, and to do that as fast as we possibly could, which is the point obviously that you were making. But also, it was inevitable that we were going to be reliant on an element of self-assessment of entitlement, particularly by employers. They are the ones who know whether their employees have been furloughed, and that is not information that we were ever going to be able to verify before paying out on claims. So it was inevitable, I think, that there was going to be a level of error and fraud, which is, applies, I'm afraid, right across the tax and tax credit system that we administer, as well as these schemes.
Yeah. I'm just doing some of the maths here on what we've worked through. Am I right in saying that this would be $2.5 billion? If the progress you expect to make is made, you'd be left with $2.5 billion outstanding, for want of an expression, which divided by the total amount of 80-odd billion would seem to me to be about 3%. Would that be roughly where you might end up, or expect to end up?
I'm not saying we need to.
I'm not looking for a promise. I'm just asking if that analysis is right, if that's what you achieve.
I mean, I think I've set out what our first provisional estimate is of the error and fraud, and what it is we believe we can achieve. Yes, it will recover some of that, and therefore that 8.7% figure will be reduced in the furlough scheme. But it is early days yet, and if we can do better, then we will.
I'm just wondering if I misunderstood it. There's a big difference between the 8.7 and the 3%, which is the figure I've just arrived at. So the 2.5 after the additional measures and the significant investment in chasing it down some of this error and fraud, the 2.5 that's left is about 3%, I think, of the 80-odd billion. So is that, if all goes to plan, is that a likely end point?
I think, going back to the figures again, roughly speaking, in terms of what we've already recovered in 2021 and what we believe we will recover from the Taxpayer Protection Task Force over 2 years, that is roughly about £2 billion.
That would take you to about 2.5. Divided by the 80-odd, you'd be about 3% at the end of that process.
That's what we would. What we're focusing on is what we can get back, rather than percentages and everything, because it's, from our point of view, it's now a practical operational exercise on making sure that we achieve that level of performance from the task force.
Thank you, Jim. To Jim, but also do please come in, Penny or Angela. What are the lessons learned from this, and what would you have done differently with the benefit of hindsight?
I think, first of all, I think we are using quite a lot of hindsight now. So at the time, we were up against a time constraint. We were up against a very serious potential chilling effect on employment and on small businesses if we had not acted fast. And therefore, some very difficult decisions had to be made about the level of controls that we would introduce. And some of the controls that we did introduce, because we felt we could not tolerate the error and fraud risk, did of course mean that some people who we would have wanted to help were excluded. So that's the kind of trade-offs that we were having to make. But if you look at the difference in the levels of error and fraud in the schemes, I think one of the key lessons from that is where we have good referential data and we can make the assessment of entitlement, you will get a lower level of error and fraud than where you are reliant on the claimant's self-assessment.
And are there areas where you could or should have done that and didn't, and would have therefore had a better result as a consequence?
I mean, it may be, if we'd had the luxury of more time, that we would have been able to collect more third-party data against which we could have verified what we were being told in the time that we had to turn claims around. But really, when we were up against it, I don't think it was realistic for us to have done much different. If I can explain what we did, so we created a control framework for if I just take furlough scheme, so we created a control framework where we identified all the key control risks in that scheme, and we identified how we were going to mitigate and manage those risks and the extent to which we were going to be able to do that pre-payment, either through the policy design of the scheme or through the controls that prevent, say, criminals getting into our systems, or through the prepayment checks after we've received a claim before we make the payment, and the extent to which we were going to manage those risks post-payment. Now, if you'd had the luxury of more time, you might have changed the balance between prepayment and post-payment checking, but I gave people 72 hours to check.
Yeah, okay, so nobody is saying that if you didn't have enough time to do something, you should therefore have done it, because clearly you can't by definition. But the question is a slightly different question, which is, were there instances or examples, looking back with hindsight, where you would have had the time to have done things differently, didn't do it, and if so, what were they, and what were the consequences of that? Or was it all perfect? You couldn't possibly have done it any better.
I think my firm view is that we did a very professional job. We risk assessed all of those claims in a 72-hour window from receipt to payment. Without extending the time it took us to pay it, I don't believe we could have done more. I don't know if Penny wants to.
No, I would agree. I mean, we were risk assessing 22 million claims in 72, in the 72-hour window pre-payment, with a very clear view to eliminating as much as possible of the risk of criminal attack. And in CGRS, that was, we estimate that's as low as 0.3%. Really active working between all of our sort of cyber and intelligence and other capabilities to make absolutely the strongest defence against that type of attack in the schemes as possible. I think we were 72 hours is not very long in which to do all of that work, so I'm really proud of the teams that did it. The hypothetical of if you had longer, what would you do? I think kind of
and that
doesn't
wasn't quite
apply.
the question. It wasn't if you'd had longer.
Yeah.
It is looking back, given the time you had and what you had to achieve, would you have done anything differently? So, I mean, my feeling, which I'll share with you, is that I totally get the pressure that you were under. I don't underestimate the achievement of having supported the labour market in the way that the Treasury and Hmrc did. I think it's an extraordinary achievement, actually. If you end up, and I've got numbers right, having 3% or thereabouts error and fraud across an £80+ billion support scheme put out the door very quickly, then that's probably not shock horror territory. That's possibly towards what one might expect. But if you're also saying, however, there was nothing that we could have done differently to have made anything better, if we had our time again, we wouldn't have changed a thing, we got it absolutely spot on, then that slightly troubles me in itself, because surely, when you're doing all these things, it must occur to you now that there are a small number of items, at least, that you might have done differently if you were to do it all over again.
I honestly can't think of anything other than, we had to make judgment calls. You could have made them differently depending on what your priorities were. You could have had systems already in place or data already in place that might have given you a richer sort of intelligence set from which to risk assess these claims. Certainly, our cyber defences, whilst they are effective and have kept organised crime to a minimum, the reality is that some taxpayers do get their credentials compromised or stolen by criminals, and we saw some evidence of that in the self-employment income support scheme, not really in the furlough scheme, and and that's something obviously we're constantly working on, trying to keep those cyber defences as up to date as we possibly can. But they really are around the margins, frankly, I think, of what you could have done against the sort of priorities that we had around time constraints and reaching as many people as possible.
Yeah, you mentioned SEISS, Jim, where the initial estimate was 1 to 2%, but that's now risen to 2.5%. What lies behind that?
I mean, Penny can elaborate a bit. I mean, a key difference between the self-employment scheme and the furlough scheme is that we calculated the quantum of the claims ourselves, so we didn't rely on claimants providing us with data, but we were dependent on making sure that we really had the gates guarded against getting into the scheme. Do you want to elaborate?
Yes, and I must admit I can't remember the precise detail that has led to that kind of increase in that assessment on that particular issue. But essentially, yes, the constant risk is that someone has their credentials compromised, as Jim says. So we're as vigilant as we possibly can be against that, and constantly seeking to tighten those defences as best we may.
Yeah, I think the main reason that I recall for the slight increase in that error rate was, we did find, particularly in the early days of the scheme, that some taxpayers came forward to make a claim and found that a claim had already been made in their identity, and their identity effectively had been stolen. And that's not because our systems were hacked, but it's often because the taxpayers have been duped into revealing their credentials through a phishing site or whatever, and we've put in cyber defences to protect that. But I think that's a key reason why in that particular scheme it was slightly higher than we predicted.
Thank you. Final question for me, and I'm just going to go to the tax gap, actually, which I know has always been a source of some pride at Hmrc, that it's been kept low by international standards. And I know that relief of the type that we're discussing isn't necessarily about the tax gap, but what has the pandemic done do you think it's done to the tax gap? Well, what are the latest numbers, and what's your latest feeling about where it's headed, and what would underlie any changes in those numbers, any shifts in those figures?
Yeah, so I think, Penny can elaborate based on, from the coalface, but I know there's not a direct parallel between the impact of COVID-19 and the financial crisis, but when we look at how taxpayers behaved following that crisis, when their incomes were really hit, and what we expect to happen after COVID-19, we didn't really see a significant change in people's behaviours in terms of their attitudes towards avoidance or evasion, and therefore I wouldn't expect to see, following the bounce back in COVID-19, any sort of fundamental change in the tax gap. Of course, we are running with a much higher level of debt as a result of the pandemic, mainly as a result of policy choices to allow people to defer VAT and self-assessment payments, and therefore the element of the tax gap that is made up of non-payment, I think, is likely to be higher than it previously was.
Can you quantify the sort of size of the sort of deferred tax element, if you might call it
so
that?
that is looking like it's going to be, the losses from that are going to be a lot less than the Office for Budget Responsibility predicted. So they made sort of public forecasts about how much of that deferred VAT and self-assessment debt would get lost. We've already exceeded, our collection has already exceeded that level. So, we are left with, I think, about 5% of the deferred VAT to collect, and we are still bringing that money in, so it'll be significantly below that. So I think that is, I'm sure, testament to some extent to Hmrc's performance, but frankly it's also testament to the bounce back of the economy, because it means that businesses that might otherwise have found themselves insolvent and unable to pay that debt actually are in a position to do so. So we expect to recover the vast majority of that. If I look at its peak, the debt balance reached about £68 billion in August 2020, but going into the pandemic it was about 15 to 16, so that's a massive increase. By the end of September 2021, it was down to £42 billion, and 11 billion of that was actually in a payment scheme. So provided the taxpayers sort of maintain their compliance with those schemes, we don't have to take any enforcement action to collect that, and that continues to go down month on month. What we found initially when we restarted collection action and started contacting the debtors was that quite a lot of it was quite soft, really, that a lot of businesses responded just by paying, and we got a very good engagement with our time to pay offer, including an automated offer that businesses could just go in and go online and sort of select a payment plan, but we are obviously down to a balance which is probably going to be tougher to work through.
Just as a technical point, how do you account in terms of the tax gap for the situation where the deferral ends up being in relation to a business that, say, goes out of business altogether, so wouldn't therefore be in a position to pay the deferred tax? Does that go into the tax gap, or how?
It does, yes. So one element of the tax gap is non-payment, and so where debtors go insolvent and don't pay their debts, that's in our accounts we score that as a write-off, and in the tax gap we count that as non-payment. And given the increased size of the debt balance and the fact that sort of insolvency enforcement was sort of non-existent during the pandemic, I think you could expect that part of the tax gap to temporarily increase. But otherwise, unless Penny has anything to add, I don't expect behaviours to change.
That's fine.
Nothing to add.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, can I just one follow-up?
Kevin, please.
Sorry,
yeah.
Just, I might have missed this, but the £2.5 billion you thought would be left in terms of fraud and error is predicted. How much will be fraud and how much will be error?
So we did publish in our provisional estimates how much of it we thought was fraud and error by scheme. I don't know, Penny, if you got the figures.
So I have. So in CJRS we thought 2.3% would be error, which is 1.4 billion, and in eatout to help out I think it was 1.5%, and we thought the estimate in SEISS was negligible. So I'm sorry, I can't monetise the eatout to help out one for you, but
Okay.
We will get better data on that, obviously, as the task force works through cases.
Okay.
And in the case of the furlough scheme, we also have a random inquiry programme where we pick up cases that aren't risk selected. Yeah. So it is possible that we will see a different balance between error and fraud. If I had to guess which way that would go, it would probably be more error and less fraud, I think.
Okay. So at least less than 50% fraud of that figure, of that £2.5 billion.
That error number is not the number left over, it's the number in the total figure. So it's not, for instance, in CJRS 1.4 billion of your maths, 2 point whatever. It's 1.4 out of the total CJRS scheme.
Yes, I get that. But I think you said there would be roughly £2.5 billion that would be defined as fraud or error. Not say you'd written it off, but you predicted.
Just to get clarity on the numbers, so we estimated that the level of error and fraud before we take post-payment enforcement action in the furlough scheme was about £5.3 billion, and of that we estimated that 1.4 billion was error. Okay. And that is something, those are numbers that we will be refining as we carry out the random inquiry programme and the post-payment compliance work. I should say, in terms of our approach to those, in how we risk assess cases and pick them up for inquiry, we are trying to focus on the most egregious end of that error and fraud. So, we are not trying to find cases where someone made a genuine mistake. If we do find those cases, we expect people to correct them. But our approach to that really has been to ask employers initially to double check their claims, and that's where that £350 million recovery has come from. We are aiming to focus as far as possible on the abusive and fraudulent behaviours. So what the eventual balance will be and what's in the residue is unclear, but my instincts are that as Penny's people work through the cases, we will find that there was more confusion and mistakes from people dealing with an unfamiliar scheme in a hurry and in a stressed situation than fraud. But I have to say, that's our current best estimate at the moment.
Right. Good to get some figures on that at some point. I still don't understand what the answer to that question is, probably. I don't know
Okay,
if you do,
if it's all right, Jim, I think we'll write to you after the session, perhaps, and just nail down exactly what it is we're after, and you can respond to that if that's right. Thank you very much. Angela, I'm coming to you anyway on customer service, but do carry on with this if that's what you'd like to do.
Just one question on this, really. The Taxpayer Protection Task Force, which has been announced with 1,265 staff. Are they new or redeployed?
They're redeployed, but what we had as part of setting up the task force was funding to bring in additional staff that we are training now.
How many
who will
additional?
make up for the Taxpayer Protection Task Force. From memory, I think it's around 1,000 staff that will be trained to replace the yield that would have been lost through over the scorecard period that would have been lost from the staff that we've redeployed into the task force.
Right, and so how long will it be until those new people are in place. Are you saying that the Taxpayer Protection Task Force is now in place and doing its job,
Yeah.
and you're backfilling so that nothing else gets missed? How long will it take before you're back up to scratch in terms of staffing?
It's a complicated picture in terms of staffing, because we also received investment in Spending Review 20 for additional staff, as well as other investments. So this year we're actually bringing into compliance around 4,200 new staff, which we've been bringing in throughout the year. They're not earmarked as for one of or other of the purposes for which they're just new staff that we're training. In general, it takes around 18 months to train a compliance officer. But obviously they start doing work, active work in a supervised context, as part of their training in the first 9 to 12 months. So the way it's calculated is that we look to recover any loss of yield over the scorecard period through the investment of those additional resources.
Okay. So you're confident you've got enough staff to deal with this fraud issue and some of the losses that have happened because of the circumstances?
Yes, I mean we're not at this point seeking more staff with that, and that's it's a very considerable injection of new resource into the compliance arena. So we're looking forward to having those people fully trained and on board and up to speed.
I want to ask Angela MacDonald, when the Public Accounts Committee gave evidence to them in December about customer service, and you were saying basically that you were going to get things back on an even keel and the numbers were going to get better in terms of customer service. Can you tell us what's actually happened with the latest publication of numbers?
Yeah, so I think when I shared at that committee, we were talking about the fact that in this last year, what we're trying to do is get ourselves back into a position where from the start of next year, we'll be able to deliver pre-pandemic levels of service. We are actually on track, actually a little bit ahead of our plan. So our aim is to get ourselves an on-target position would see us with a head of work of about 2 million items. Now, I know that sounds like an enormously large number, but we get about 1.8 to 2 million pieces of post every month. So it's not it's the right kind of figure. The challenge...
Things have got worse, haven't they?
No.
Since you talked to the PAC,
No.
your latest publication showed the numbers getting worse.
So the challenge with the there's always an interesting question on statistics. So our reporting shows the percentage of stuff that is cleared in 15 days. Yeah. When you are clearing older stock, every single thing that you're doing is not making any difference to that target because the 15 days is long past, and so therefore it's over. You have two choices when looking at improving your service. You can either sort of start at the back, as in those who've been waiting the longest get done first. That's a way of doing it, which means, though, that every clearance you're making is making no difference whatsoever to your latest statistics.
There's no incentive because your performance measurements are about time. If that time's gone, there are no incentives whatsoever for you to deal with the backlog because it makes your performance stats go down. Is that what you're saying?
No, sorry, forgive me, I'm trying to explain to you how the maths works and why the stats look as they do. There's a really good reason why it's important to deliver service within targets, and that is because when service is delivered outside of targets, it becomes more expensive because customers ring you, chase you, ask for more. It simply makes your work stack higher. So if you're actually going to deliver any kind of decent service, you've got to be able to deliver within something that the customers think is a timely amount. So there is not simply because it's the right thing to do, there is every financial incentive for us to make sure that we're delivering service because it's actually the cheapest and most effective way of delivering service. So as we get ourselves back through this period, we will bring that old stock down, so bringing it all back through that backlog, absolutely. So we're bringing all of that down, which is exactly where we're at, so that when we get to the point of the beginning of April, when effectively the maths starts again, and we are back within our normal kind of head of work, then that starting at the back of the queue is simply stuff which is well within that kind of appropriate
So you are
timescale.
expecting to get the backlog, if I can call it that, down by the end of the financial
absolutely
year?
Are. We are actually ahead of our plan for that. You're quite right that because of that oldest thing, you don't see it in the stats. So what's going to be quite interesting is it may appear by that measure that life will look like something in March, and then in April it will look like it has stepped up quite considerably, and that's because, as I say, the clock starts again.
Might be a good idea to have a measurement of backlog so that we can make better sense of the performance stats.
I think I'm quite happy to look at that. Certainly, we have that management information. Yeah. We quarterly give performance against the target, and as you say, as we've been clearing that backlog, we have not been making an impact on that target, but we certainly have information about the size of our stockpile and its average age and everything. I mean, what I would say is, what we've tried to do this year on getting back to an even keel is, first of all, we got our phone performance up to a level that we, is giving a decent service. As we got more and more resources free after that, we didn't add that into making the phone service even better. We then put them on to getting the post stockpile down, and similarly on Penny's side, getting compliance back on an even keel has been the key thing. The one area of our work that I would say will not be in an even keel position at the end of the year, a key piece of our work, is the debt balance, which is still going to continue to be much higher than in a normal time, and that will take a couple of years.
I mean, Jim, when you gave evidence to the Public Accounts Committee, you said something quite surprising, that you were not resourced to give brilliant customer service, you were resourced to give decent customer service. Now, do you want to spend a little bit of time telling us what the difference between decent and brilliant is?
I certainly shouldn't say anything surprising at Select Committee, so let me unpack that. I mean, but I stand by what I said. So for example, we have got our call handling performance up to 80% advisor attempts handled, which means that 80% of calls that are put through to an advisor are picked up by an advisor. Now, but for the other 1 in 5 callers, they have to call back because their call does not get picked up the first time. Now, ideally, I would like to get that to 100%. That would be a brilliant service. I do not have the resources to do that. But I believe that the level of performance that we have reached gives taxpayers a decent service in that they can contact us, they can transact with us at peak times. Some of them may have to phone back, but they will get through. And we can tell from our customer satisfaction levels that we measure and our net easy score that we're getting fairly high levels of satisfaction, particularly with the digital services, but also when we bring that phone service up to that level, we're getting a good level of satisfaction.
What about post-clearance? What's the difference between brilliant and decent?
Well, my post-clearance target is to reply to 80% of post within 15 working days. In this day and age, I suspect some people will say that is not brilliant, and they would expect to see a quicker turnaround than that. But that, with 2 million pieces of post coming in a month, that is realistically what we can achieve if we manage that really well. If I look at the spending review settlement that we've had for the next 3 years, that is, I'm satisfied, whilst it's a tough settlement, that it gives us enough to maintain that decent level of service over those 3 years.
Right, so you can't move towards brilliant with the spending review settlement. All you can do is maintain decent.
Yeah, I mean, we will shortly be, we're in the process now of agreeing what our targets are that we can achieve. But yes, I wouldn't, not only, when I say I'm not funded to deliver a brilliant service, I'm not funded to be on a track to deliver a brilliant service. And if I was a Treasury official, which I'm never going to be,
especially not after this.
I might say that if I had spare funds, that's not maybe what I would spend it on, because I've got other things I need to do. And I have to say, even as Chief Executive of Hmrc, internally, if I was given additional funds, would I say that's what I would choose to spend it on when we've got error and fraud and everything else to deal with? So it is a balancing act.
Fair enough, and thanks for your very open response to that. What about VAT registrations? Why are they taking so long at the moment?
So VAT registrations have now recovered to within service levels. What we have seen, however, with VAT registrations is an enormous increase in the level of registrations. I think a tenfold increase.
Yeah, it is about that.
Compared with normal times, and that is primarily as a result of the new VAT rules for online sales, which have prompted huge numbers of overseas sellers to register for VAT. So it is a good news story in terms of, I think it points to those measures bringing in much more of the previously lost VAT yield than we had anticipated, but did mean that we were overwhelmed is a strong word, but our service levels, we had a level of registrations far in excess of what we had forecast. But we are now back on turning those around.
We absolutely
So
are.
how bad was it at its worst, and where are you now with it?
I think at its worst you were probably waiting. Actually, correct the figures if I'm incorrect. But at the worst you were waiting sort of 12, 16 weeks for a VAT registration. We are now back within the target, which is I think 30 days. So, but the reality is an awful lot of this is digital. So once the customer gets through that initial phase, all then the subsequent signing up is all digitally done and it's instant. Our aim is to get things done a lot faster than that. We're very aware of both registration of VAT and actually deregistration of VAT are incredibly important parts of the business process. So we always seek to outperform. It's a backstop measure, not an ambition measure, if that makes sense.
Okay, so you can give us some reasonable assurance then that given the fact that we've had this one-off huge bulge in applications because of changes at the border, presumably, that won't happen again, and you can keep up with it.
We absolutely can. We absolutely can, and I think one of the things that these kind of changes in the economy help us is with learning those lessons and therefore thinking about how we change our forecasting. So, as things move around, it's always about matching the volume of colleagues that you have available for the work. So Insight tells us that the economy is moving around, in which case we train more people and therefore that we keep that target there. So we'll take that learning in, flush that then through the forecast for next year, increase the volume of colleagues that we need on that group if necessary to make sure that we deliver the target. These are the kind of processes where when you get behind, they have ripple down effects into the rest, not only for the business, but also for the rest then of the servicing. So as you can imagine, we have hundreds and hundreds of different work types. Some of those are quite standalone, but others, if you get behind there, other problems occur, and VAT registration is one of those, so it's incredibly important we stay on top of it. So we are at the minute, and that's where we'll stay.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thanks, Angela. Can I just a quick follow-up question or two? Angela, I remember when I was the minister that you dealt with, and we used to discuss these very issues of customer backlogs and everything, and I was always impressed with the way you handled things, I have to say. But we always used to discuss channel shifting, so getting people out of using telephones or writing and into interfacing via the internet, etc. Can you talk to us just a bit about that and how that programme is going? And in particular, one of the things I recall that I used to focus on quite a lot and push hard on was the quality of guidance that there is online, which of course in turn can head off a lot of problems that if the guidance is not very good, you otherwise accrue in terms of demand.
Yeah, so will you be pleased to know we are still making progress. So Hmrc is already an 85% digital organisation. So it's interesting when we focus on customer service being about phones and posts. The reality is that by far the majority of our taxpayers never actually have to have an interaction with us as Hmrc because it all moves through digitally. And transformations like making tax digital and the transformation for VAT are an extra part of that overall digital progress. On the specifics that you talk about there, about things like online guidance, what's been interesting in the last couple of years has been how technology has shifted to allow us to do some really quite interesting things. So things like putting digital assistants onto our parts of our manuals, because at the minute, you go in and if you don't ask quite the right question, you don't get quite the right information back. And there's an enormous amount of tax information available through the manuals and the guidance that we put out. We have invested in some really new and very innovative technology to do something a little bit more innovative. So what is it that you want to know? And in which case the artificial assistant will offer you back the guidance that you want, rather than you having to navigate through the indices and hope that you're going to land on the correct part. So we're at the early stages of that kind of bot type implementation, but we have big plans for that as part of our work as we go through this next spending review period. We need to continue that journey for digital, not only because our spending review settlement assumes that we will, because then you become more no-touch in there, so we've got efficiencies that we need to deliver, but also because that's what the customer expects from us. It's what they get from everybody else, and they expect that from us as a tax authority as well. So it's a win all the way round. Now, we do need to be mindful that we have a whole load of people who are digitally excluded, and Hmrc has to service the entire of the population. So we do need to make sure that our other channels are available, but our aim is that where a customer or a business can serve themselves and can go digital, how do we ensure and help and remove the barriers to helping them do that, so that the human interactions are reserved for the people for whom going digital is not something that they are going to manage.
That's helpful. I think, is there anything you can share with the committee after this session to demonstrate that the delivery side of that aspiration is being achieved and what the plans are around that? I think that would be helpful, because I think it's so vital that
we can demonstrate that, you know, as a result, the volume of phone calls, for example, that we get year on year is going down. Yeah.
And Jim, sorry, very quickly, and I don't want you to dwell on it now, perhaps you could write to the committee on this. During the course of your answers to Angela, you, in passing, mentioned the debt and that you thought it would take 2 years to get the debt down. Could you write to us just to let us know what's in that debt? I assume it's the deferred VAT and various other items, and how much is involved and what resources you're applying to actually trying to get that debt down. I think it'd be useful to us to get a handle of the size of the issue, how much money is at stake, and what it is that you're planning to do to get that money in as fast as possible.
Yes, that's fine. I mean, the National Audit Office, recently did a report on it, and so I can certainly give you the information on that, and we'll shortly be publishing the most up-to-date information.
Great, thank you. And Alison, please.
Thank you, Chair. I've got some questions around tax debt management, and some of these follow up on answers to my colleagues. And if I could ask first, Jim, when you told the Public Accounts Committee earlier this month, earlier that you get debt down in a couple of years, can you elaborate exactly how long and what your aim is there?
Yeah, I mean, I can feel myself being increasingly locked into this forecast. So, I mean, I think a key point was that, an objective I have for the organisation is that by now that we have stopped administering the COVID support schemes and subject to managing the iron fraud, that we need to get back on an even keel, and I want to start in the next financial year running the tax and customs and tax credit system in a sort of pre-pandemic way, and having sort of levels that we recognise. But the exception to that will be debt. I mean, normally we would have between 15 and 19 billion pound debt balance on our balance sheet. I will not have, that's not what I will have on my balance sheet at the end of this year. It'll probably be, the tax debt will probably be somewhere between 33 and 36 billion pounds, and it will take us time to work through that and get that back down to a normal level, and my estimate is that it'll take us a couple of years to do that. Now, that is in part because there was a pause on insolvency action, for example, so we start from a sort of standing start on some of that debt, but it's also quite uncertain because it sort of depends on what the economy does. So when, for example, we previously forecast that the debt balance at the end of this financial year would be £33 billion, and that was before Omicron and Plan B. That has caused us to revise that figure, and I think it could be that now between 33 and 36. Having said that, the economy is now opening up again, so it may well be that things will get better. So there's quite a lot of uncertainty, but that's the reason why it's going to take a bit longer for that part of the business to get into a normal situation. Our approach to that is, we've got a principle that we're not trying to get the debt out of the taxpayer, we're trying to get the taxpayer out of debt. And in particular, we don't want any viable business to go to the wall because of our collection activity. So we want to encourage debtors to engage with us, to pay what they can afford to pay and get their debt out of an unmanaged position into a managed position. And what I think we were quite successful on in the last year is both for self-assessment and for VAT, we opened up digital services that enabled taxpayers to just go online and say, I can't afford to pay this off in one go, this is what I can afford to pay, and they just set up payment arrangements. They didn't have to speak to an Hmrc advisor. Anyone who couldn't cope with that standard offer was able to speak to an advisor and get a bespoke payment arrangement. But there's still quite a few of those taxpayers in debt who just have not engaged with us, and that's what we need to get them to do.
Thank you. I'll go back to that point, but would you say that the tax debt might be at pre-pandemic levels in 2 years' time? Would you be as bold as saying that, or is that going to be longer than that? A couple is quite vague.
By a couple I do mean two. I mean,
okay.
I would really like to see my debt balance back to a normal level at the end of two financial years. That will be through a combination of collection, enforcement action, but also catching up with. We did not do the sort of writing off of debts last year that we would normally do because there were very few insolvencies. So some of that will be going through that process with taxpayers, which has now restarted and is returning to about pre-pandemic levels.
And you talked about the kind of steps you're going through with the kind of softer debt and getting to those people. Presumably that means you're now at the harder end of that debt.
I mean, I think we are. What we found when we started collection activity was we segmented debtors for the first time, which we haven't traditionally done. So we looked at data that we had and determined sort of high, medium, low impact of the pandemic on that taxpayer, and we applied different approaches to those three segments. And sure enough, we found that those that our data predicted had a lower impact were more likely to respond to say, yes, here's your VAT and here's your pay as you earn, whereas the higher impacted ones were more likely to contact us and say, I can't afford to pay this, or I can only afford to pay a small amount of it on an ongoing basis. Now, that segmentation just is for our initial approach. Once we get engaged with the taxpayer, we kind of abandon our assessment of them. We do that on an individual, tailored basis. But I think that's the way that we will approach it. And I think we are probably looking at the higher impact people.
That's interesting. And how did that segmentation work? Was that by sector?
No, it wasn't sectorised at all, because in fact we have found that attempting to do this by sector doesn't really give you good results. If I take, say, brewing as an example, some brewers very severely affected by the pandemic because if they were on sales brewers, if you like, with tied premises, they couldn't sell their beer. Others quite quickly pivoted to off sales and were not so severely affected because the British public enjoyed drinking at home during the pandemic. So we kind of abandoned sectors. What we did was look at data that we had on things like their turnover from their VAT returns compared with pre-pandemic levels, the extent to which they had or had not furloughed their staff according to their furlough claims, and sort of stratified them on that basis.
Okay, well that's interesting, thank you. I'd seen the National Audit Office say that the return on your investment for debt collection, the rate of return is £205 for every pound spent yourselves. But for private debt collectors that you use, it's £18 for every pound spent, return on investment. Can I ask, at which point do you turn things over to those private debt collectors, and is that really worth the money if that's what you get back for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you've seen the Public Accounts Committee discussion on that, I mean, I think we've got some more work to do to get like-for-like comparison. So that sort of 205 to 1 is just the... if you compare the cost of my debt management function with the money that comes in that was allocated to the debt management function, but in there is a whole range of debt that is very different from the debt that we give to debt collection agencies, so it's not a like-for-like comparison. I think our best view is if we do a like-for-like comparison, it'll probably turn out that we are as efficient as the debt collection agencies, and we, broadly speaking, achieve the same turnaround. But we've got to do a bit more work, I think, to validate that. So what we do is, first of all, we try to make initial contact with the debtors ourselves, and if they engage with us, fine. If they don't engage with us, then we parcel up debts, and we pass them to a debt collection agency to try and make contact with the customer on our behalf. And we parcel those up according to the sort of skill set of the particular debt collection agency and the data sets that they have. We expect them then to follow our policies and processes. So the debtor will get the same service in terms of time to pay arrangements or whatever it is. And then at the end of that, if the debt collection agency cannot engage with the debtor or can't get them into an agreed payment plan, they hand that residue back to us and we take our own action. All of the activity about debt collection agencies is desk-based, so they do telephone calls, SMS, post. They don't do any visits to premises and they don't take any enforcement action on our behalf.
Okay, that's useful to know. On slightly separate issues, the government's brought forward proposals that will be in the finance bill later today on a public interest business protection tax. Clearly that's going to be an additional thing for you to do, and I just wondered what the kind of operational impact of this would be on Hmrc. Are you able to say that, given how quickly this announcement has appeared?
So, I mean, that tax is intended to be a sort of backstop to protect the exchequer from some activity that utility firms could undertake that would not be fair to the public purse. I very much hope that it is not going to have any operational impact on me at all, and I very much hope to report that I'm going to collect zero from it in due course, because it is intended to deter some behaviours that we don't want to see. But it is there in the finance bill for me to enforce in the event that any utility firm undertakes the activities that it's intended to deter.
That was my suspicion, but that's useful to know, particularly ahead of the bill later on.
It's quite unusual to have a tax that I expect to collect zero from.
Yes, it's unusual, I would say. And just on another slightly different matter, it's been brought to my attention that the Hmrc website has been amended, and the changes that it says rates for working tax credit, child's tax credit, child benefit and guardian's allowance for the 2022 to 23 tax year are provisional and may change between now and the 6th of April 2022. Do you know something we don't?
Personally, I don't.
No.
Do either of you know something I don't?
No.
I'll have to take that up. I know you'd want probably an early answer to that.
It would be useful, yeah.
I don't know what lies behind that.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. Julie, please.
Thank you, Chair. I've got some more questions actually on making tax digital. But I'll ask you, Jim, but if Angela or Penny want to come in, please feel free. Making tax digital for income tax. You announced that it was going to be delayed for another year in September. What was the reason for that?
Primarily to give businesses more time, particularly with the impact of the pandemic. The work that you might have expected both taxpayers and tax agents and software houses to be devoting on getting ready for MTD, we suspected that they were not going to be able to do, so it was decided to give an extra year to people. During that time, that gives us more time, obviously, to work with them and pilot that and get it right, but it was really to enable businesses to focus on recovering from the effect of the pandemic.
And you mentioned the pilot. How many businesses have you got signed up for the pilot?
So at this stage, we have not marketed the pilot or tried to sort of attract people into it, because we want to start with initially a small number. I think we've got 9 people in initially, and this is broadly speaking the approach that we took with VAT as well back in 2019. So our approach will be to start with a very small number of people, sort of do a handheld approach, which won't obviously mimic real world when millions are using it, but have a handheld approach to prove all of the processes, then invite more people to come in to the pilot and then start doing it in a larger scale. And our way of doing that will be via the software providers. So we are unlikely to go out directly to the taxpayers and ask them to come in. We're likely to invite software providers to bring their clients into the pilot so they can test their products and test their own service models as well as ours. Okay,
so 9 to start with. Can you give a bit more detail about the milestones in there? What kind of numbers will your next number look like, and when would that be, for example?
Okay, I'll have to write to you for that. I apologise. I haven't got the step-up plan, but I'm very happy to follow it through with you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, because I mean, you need there's a point where it's critical mass. Otherwise, it just doesn't become meaningful for.
Absolutely right. So forgive me, if one of my colleagues had been here, she would have been able to just say it all off the tip of her tongue. But you're absolutely right. There are well-worn sort of standards about what looks acceptable for when you move from an alpha through a beta and then out into a full delivery. And we follow those methodologies through. So I'll happily share through. But it would be exactly as you would expect to be robust enough to give us the learning that we need to have.
Thank you. And so can you give us an idea of the timescales that you're looking at for the pilot at all? If you can't and you want to do that separately, that's fine. But
yeah, I think we are going to take that extra period to pilot for longer. So even when you actually eventually go live, you're still in a learning phase with a really good quality digital service. I'll include all the details when I follow it all through with you. But we're not doing nothing for a year and then going, now we'll do the pilot. We are the pilot starting, and we are therefore using that extra time in order to really make the most out of that pilot period.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I'll ask Jim again. The process, the programme as a whole has been delayed quite significantly over time. Mm-hmm. Given this extra delay, pandemic notwithstanding, how confident are you that there won't be more delays to the programme?
Well, I mean, first of all, I do want to get it implemented as quickly as possible, because it is about helping taxpayers to get their affairs right and reducing the sort of scope for them to make mistakes. It does have a positive effect on the tax gap, but I think it is more important that we get it right. We need to manage the transitional impact on businesses in particular and get them on the right footing going forward. The VAT, taking time on the VAT one, I think, has paid dividends. So as well as getting the vast majority of the mandated businesses in, about a third of the non-mandated businesses have voluntarily joined that, and it has gone pretty smoothly from the point of view of administering the VAT system and has not caused any disruption. So I think that we have to balance time with that, but I think the quality of the implementation is really important. Having said that, it is important that we get on with modernisation, because other countries are doing this, and the UK has got to keep up with having a modern way of administering the tax system, and we've been affected, I think, by sort of quite a lot of sort of engagement with stakeholders in the early days about getting acceptance of this programme, which I think we're in a much better position now, and then by the pandemic. And so we've definitely lost time, and we've also changed the order in which we've implemented it. So we didn't intend at the outset to start with VAT, but we went about it that way, I think, in response to stakeholder requests. But the UK, in my view, needs to be faster at modernising its tax system, or it's going to increasingly get left behind.
So as a distinct programme, what does the end look like, and when do you think we'll see an end? Will we ever see an end?
Well, I think there are, after income tax, there are more streams of tax which are not yet in Making Tax Digital, but also I think that over time, as a live service, we will want to deepen its functionality, because it gives us a real opportunity to engage with taxpayers and constantly improve the way we communicate with them, and the way that digital solutions can support them to get their tax right. And I think one of the challenges is moving from a programmatized approach to implementing this to actually carrying on investing in it as a digital solution that has to constantly evolve. So as well as extending beyond VAT and income tax into other taxes, I think we want to increasingly look at how we can enrich the sort of nudges and prompts and playbacks to businesses that MTD and the proprietary software that it uses provides, to give us different ways of managing the tax gap than deploying thousands and thousands of tax inspectors to investigate.
Okay, thank you. One of the things that the MTD is supposed to do is to reduce the self-assessment or the tax gap overall, but actually some figures we've seen have actually shown that the tax gap for self-assessment is widening. Does that mean it's not working? I mean, are we putting resources into something that's not working?
Yeah, I think one of the real challenges on the self-assessment number is because the pounds number is shifting, but as a proportion of the overall tax take, actually it's going down. So the self-assessment tax gap was 6.1 billion in 15-16 and 7 billion in 19-20. but it was actually 15.1% of the liability in 15-16 and only 13.4% of the liability in 19-20. So the tax population and the tax take is getting larger, so therefore as a percentage of the liabilities, actually the self-assessment tax gap is going down, it's not going up.
Okay, have you got any projections from now going forwards that
Shall I add it to the list of things I'm going to write to you about?
that would be really helpful.
Yeah,
Thank you.
no
Thank you,
problem.
Chair. Thank you.
Just very quickly on MTD for income tax, presumably it's much more of a challenge to bring it in for income tax than it was for VAT back in 2019, because of course businesses are already interacting, or were at that point, with you regarding VAT returns, etc., whereas they're not in this case. So could you comment on that? And secondly, within the MTD income tax project, is there a subset in there of particularly difficult individuals or partnerships, whatever it may be, that's going to be quite difficult to squeeze out at the end and get to work?
Yes, so first of all, if you take VAT, the way we approached VAT, so I mean you're right, VAT payers have a more regular contact with Hmrc than self-assessment payers do, because they tend to make quarterly, or some, if they're repayment cases, often monthly VAT returns. So they were much more used to a cycle. We also started with businesses that had turnovers above the VAT threshold of £85,000, so they tended to be the larger end of small businesses, and we did not initially mandate it for the smaller VAT businesses. And you would expect those larger businesses, first of all, to already have a higher take-up of digital accounting tools, but also just to be that bit more sophisticated about that. Although we are now mandating all VAT payers, so we are going into that lower turnover group next. The self-assessment population is much larger and is quite different. It includes, as well as the self-employed who are not registered for VAT, the landlords as well, and so they are a different group. On the other hand, several million of them will already be using digital products to keep their records and will be filing VAT filings that way, and so they will already be familiar with MTD. So it's just that additional group really that has got the task of, from a standing start of getting there. But yes, they are a different population, and there'll be different challenges, and certainly there are some people in there who are not necessarily represented taxpayers who are used to using digital products, and we will have to manage that with them. In terms of more difficult groups, certainly general partnerships we are going to bring on in a later phase. We did this in VAT as well, where we brought the bulk of people on straight away, but there were one or two sort of unusual groups whose VAT returns look a bit different, who we just had to bring on to a slightly different timetable. But general partnerships would be the key ones for self-assessment, where we are going to take, I think, a year longer to bring them on board.
Thank you. Gareth, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Jim, I just want to ask you a few questions about staff engagement at Hmrc and the pay deal that you recently secured. So in the civil service people's survey, I understand that Hmrc consistently scores pretty low in terms of staff engagement, and last year was no different. In your annual report, I think you flagged staff engagement as an amber risk. It was a risk that you flagged as a serious concern. So why do you think Hmrc staff engagement is so poor compared to lots of other departments in government?
So first of all, I would say that, you're right that historically in Whitehall, Hmrc has been one of the departments with the lowest staff engagement. However, that has significantly changed in recent years. I'm proud that in the 2 years since I've been Chief Executive, that has increased by 10 points. That last year we scored an increase that actually no other department, I think only one other department, succeeded in achieving. So our engagement levels have been going up, both in absolute terms and relative to other departments in Whitehall. And I think when you compare us, I don't tend to compare us with all departments. I tend to compare us with the big operational departments like Home Office, Department for Work and Pensions, MOJ, because they've got workforces quite similar to mine. So we have made significant advances. Having said that, it's not good enough. I want HMRC to be a great place for people to work in, not least because we are in quite a tight labour market, and I need to be able to attract and retain the right skills to deliver what we have to do. So, myself and my executive team still completely on this and see this as a key priority for us, hence what we've put in our annual report. So both pride in what we've achieved, but also I think we've got to keep on at that and do better. The pay and contract reform was a key thing. I think when I appeared before this committee shortly after being made Chief Executive, I said one of my top priorities was to achieve that, and I'm proud that we managed to do that last year. Obviously, the headline is that we got a 3%, 5%, 5% rise for our colleagues on average, but we also did get reforms to our terms and conditions, which mean that I now have contracts of employment which fit much better with what I need to run the business and to give the services to taxpayers that we want. So, for example, when we look at telephony performance, prior to these reforms, I did not have contracts that enabled me to deploy colleagues in line with the opening hours of my call centres. So, I was reliant really on volunteers to say, yes, I will work into the evening. And you saw a big drop-off in our telephony performance at a certain time of the day when colleagues who weren't prepared to do that left for home. Now I have got contracts where I can deploy colleagues in the evenings, I can deploy them on Saturdays. We've got agreement to that, and that will really help me to deliver the business better, as well as giving people the flexible ways of working and the better pay that they want. So that is, I think, an important achievement for us. And we did see in the last People survey, I think it was a 45-point increase in the number of people who are satisfied with their pay. On the other hand, I'm about to give them the last pay rise of that 3-year deal in June, so I'm pretty sure people will be wanting to know what happens after that.
Why is engagement so important to the taxpayer and to you as a chief executive, do you think?
So I need colleagues to be engaged because there's plenty of evidence that engaged workforces perform, but also that they are willing to be flexible for the organisation. And if the pandemic has taught us one thing, it is that we are completely reliant on a flexible workforce that are willing to switch their skills onto whatever it is we need them to do. But also we are in a tight labour market, and people looking for young people looking for a job want to see an organisation where they think I want to go in there and do a good job, but I want to be happy in there, and those are the reasons why it's important to me.
Okay, I mean, I take what you're saying about you've improved the engagement, but there are still 104 different government departments that had better engagement scores than Hmrc, so I think it's right that you flag it as a risk. And I completely understand what you're saying about pay. I read your comments at the Public Accounts Committee, and I know you've said in this committee as well that you are very proud. But given the fact that inflation is now at 5.4%, how happy are your staff with that pay deal, given the levels of inflation that are currently being reported?
Yes, I mean, I know that sort of economic circumstances have changed around people, and everyone is affected, not just my colleagues. I mean, I think colleagues recognised that it was an achievement for the department to be able to land that pay offer and get it approved by Cabinet Office and Treasury in very difficult times. Obviously, as you would expect with Treasury and Cabinet Office, I had to show a payback for that rise, which we were able to do with the changes in terms and conditions and the way we could deploy people. So, and we saw an overwhelming majority of colleagues in the ballots voting in favour of the deal. So it was, we brought it back for them. Colleagues knew they had to give something in return for it, and in overwhelming numbers they signed up to doing that. And despite the disruption of the pandemic, we are seeing colleagues working in the new working patterns and delivering on the benefits.
So I get that, and it was an achievement, and I'm pleased that they were pleased. But what I'm asking is, are the staff still pleased, given that in real terms their increase won't mean a great deal because of inflation? And if their pay is such a big factor to their engagement, do you feel that your engagement will increase next year as a result of the pay increase?
I fully intend to carry on increasing my engagement levels. So I want to see that happening, and that's despite obviously the difficult times in which everyone's living. First of all, my colleagues know that they live in the same times as everybody else, and so they know what it is that everybody in the country has to cope with in terms of cost of living, and that applies to them as it applies to everyone else. I would say that of course pay was important to people, but when we looked at what colleagues wanted, it wasn't just the level of pay, it was a sense of being valued and a sense of fairness between colleagues. So we had ended up in a situation where we had dozens and dozens of different contract types. I suspect more than dozens, actually.
Yeah, more than dozens.
And you had some colleagues who felt that their contract caused them to be deployed in a certain way that other colleagues didn't, gave them different leave entitlement than other colleagues. So it wasn't just about pay, it was a sense of I want to know that I'm valued and I want to know that I'm treated fairly with my colleagues. I've now got really the whole organisation onto a common footing in terms of the terms and conditions that they have.
So you're not going to be going back to the Treasury asking for more money to pay your staff more?
It is open to me to do so, but you have to make a case for that. And obviously I was able to make the case last time round. It's more challenging because I've taken those benefits out of the organisation, so I can't take them again. But it is open to any permanent secretary if they can make a case to do so.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Gareth. And could I go to Harriet, please?
Thank you, Chair. And I want to ask you to put yourself in the position of someone who's been self-employed over the last few years, and you've had the changes announced in terms of IR35, then you went through the pandemic, and obviously that was a very challenging time, particularly if you paid yourself through your own personal service company. And I noticed that since the economy started to recover and employment's recovering strongly, it is mainly payroll employment that is above its pre-pandemic peak. And I just wondered if Hmrc had any insight into whether that bounce back is because people are choosing now to go on payroll, whether it's a reaction to IR35, whether it's a reaction to the way that self-employed people were treated differently from people who were on payroll during the pandemic. Have you got any thoughts or data on that?
Yes, so first of all, I think it's probably just to be clear about tax definitions. So people who are self-employed for tax purposes are not affected by IR35. IR35 affects people who work in the same as like employees and ensures that they pay taxes like employees. But obviously, many of those people regard themselves as freelancers. They work in temporary gigs, if you like. But strictly speaking, from a tax point of view, they're not self-employed, and the self-employed are not affected by that measure. So IR35 has obviously been in place for a very long time, well over 20 years. What has changed in the last 5 years is the way that we administer it in response to very high levels of non-compliance with the rules. So that doesn't change the amount at all of tax that people are liable for, but it does mean that we are administering it in a different way to tackle that non-compliance and to make sure that we get that tax. So we started in 2017 with contractors who work in the public sector, and then last year extended that to large and mid-sized businesses in the private sector as well. And I think it is right that what you're saying is correct, that that measure is one of the reasons why we are seeing a reduction in personal service companies, and we are seeing those workers either go onto the payroll of the businesses that engage them, or go onto the payroll of an umbrella company, which the engager then gets the worker, the temporary worker from. That is, just a reaction of the arrangements in response to those measures. It's not unexpected, and I don't think we are concerned that that is a problem. It's a choice that, it's a sort of logical choice that engagers and workers are making following the change in the administration, where having your own personal service company is now sort of not so attractive.
But I'm sure that colleagues and yourselves will have been contacted by people who are affected by these changes, and there are a lot of people who are concerned and allege that there have been suicides linked to these changes and some of the arrears. Are you comfortable with how you're treating the individuals who've been through such a tough time during a pandemic anyway in these circumstances?
I think there may be two slightly different issues at play there. I mean, certainly in the case of the off-payroll working reforms, I am not aware of that generating distress amongst people. I know it's a big change for people, and I know that it does mean that going forward, people are going to be paying tax that those arrangements were liable for in the past, but that they were not paying. But there is a separate part of the tax system where we have seen over a number of years people using disguised remuneration avoidance schemes, and these may well be similar types of workers to workers who have got personal service companies, where we have been taking action to recover the tax lost under those schemes, and have been implementing a measure called the loan charge for people who have not settled their use of those schemes with us. And we do know that that involves life-changing bills for people who didn't think they were going to get those bills, and does mean that we have to watch out for people who need extra support or who are mentally distressed and need care.
Sir Amias Morse did a review of the implementation. Is it time to look at it again, do you think?
That would be, that wouldn't be a matter for me. There was an independent review. I think there were something like 13 recommendations, 20 recommendations. I think the government accepted all but one of them and has implemented them, including enacting them where legislation was required. We are now in the process of, collecting the loan charge from people who are liable to it. We are doing that in the most sort of sympathetic way we can, taking account of the circumstances of the individual taxpayer. So, as I said, if anyone presents to us that they cannot afford to pay the big tax bill, then we've got tried and tested ways in which we, our debt management service, give people time to pay and make sure that they've got affordable payment arrangements. And if anyone that we deal with displays signs of distress, which means that they need extra support, then first of all, Penny has got an extra support service which gives them a special service, but in addition our people are trained to identify that and, if necessary, refer it to bodies who can help those people.
Yes, and we would not only, all of my counter-avoidance caseworkers have been trained to support people who need extra help and to identify those, and we would put particular measures in place to support people, making sure they had named contacts and were given regular kind of contact in advance of us taking any steps in relation to their particular situation. And as Jim has said, we reach out to ensure that people understand the options available to support them to pay in a manageable way the liabilities that they have accrued. It is a very difficult situation, and we do recognise that, and we do everything in our power to to support people in that position. And I think one thing I would really encourage is that people who are in that position get in touch with Hmrc. It is often the hardest thing for people to do who are worried about their tax affairs, but we are here to help them resolve that position, and having it hanging over them is very difficult.
Given that your department's in regular contact with these people, you can assure the committee that there haven't been any suicides then?
So we are aware of a number of cases in which people who have been involved in tax avoidance have taken their own lives, very sadly. In those circumstances, we report that to the Independent Office of Police Conduct, as we are bound to do, as our enforcement activities are overseen there, and they will make a decision about whether or not to seek an investigation or to ask us to investigate the circumstances, and we do take that very seriously.
Can I turn to this implementation with the public sector, which was rolled out first. And I noticed in the annual reports and accounts of various government departments, they are now having to pay you extra money because of discovering that they were affected by these rules. Do you anticipate that when this rolls out to large and medium-sized businesses that you'll find similar amounts of money? And can you share with the committee how much so far you have found that people were liable to pay you?
I think the public sector bodies that the 2017 rules apply to, they are obviously obliged to report in their annual accounts any liabilities or provisions that they're having to make for underpayment of tax, and several of them, as you say, have declared that in their annual accounts, and that reflects either action that Hmrc has taken to look into how they implemented those measures, or internal steps that they may have taken themselves to review things. And I think we certainly did then learn from the 2017 implementation, and make changes and improvements to how we implemented things for the private sector businesses last year. It's still too early to say what we will see in post implementation compliance checking, and that will obviously be an ongoing thing. But our priority so far has been to support them to get it right. But we will obviously over time then be going in to audit and check what businesses have done.
You know how much it's raised so far?
I think that overall the total, I think it was 215 million in year one and 250 million in year two after the 2017 measures. But the Office of Budget Responsibility will have published how much additional tax they expect to come from that measure, including the extension to the private sector. I mean, obviously there was a very high level of non-compliance with the IR35 rules, and these changes are intended to bring in that tax that we were not succeeding in collecting before. So I would expect this...
It's in line with the forecast that you had at the time when you brought in the changes?
Yes, I believe so.
Right. And Penny, in terms of the umbrella companies themselves, are you comfortable with the way that they are operating, or are you concerned that some are actually promoting tax avoidance schemes, not just to contractors but to other workers?
So I think there are very many compliant and capable umbrella companies out there. However, there is a subset of umbrellas that are involved in disguised remuneration, as well as what we call mini umbrella fraud. And we have, we certainly moved to both educate individuals and contractors about the dangers of that, as well as employers about the warning signs they should look out for.
Where can people check to see whether this is a...
So we So we do not approve umbrella companies, but we do put a lot of information out, both directly onto obviously gov.uk, but we've had a big communications campaign which involves social media. Also, we write to individuals where we believe they may have got involved, where our data shows we believe they may have got involved in disguised remuneration. So we've written to 33,000 people in the last year and 3 quarters to say to them, we think you might be involved. Would you like to get out of this? If that is the case, get in touch. So we are trying to address that risk in a whole range of different ways. We also work with people across, we work with the Advertising Standards Authority to make sure that the advertisements that might be online are accurate and that they're taken down if they're not accurate. We have a hugely wide-ranging programme to tackle that small subset of non-compliant umbrellas.
I should add that Hmrc, Treasury and the Department for Business have issued a joint call for evidence on the activities of umbrella companies, and both in relation to tax compliance but also in relation to the labour market and how they treat their workers. As Penny says, there's a range from very compliant umbrella companies through to ones that abuse the tax system and also abuse their workers, and that call for evidence will hopefully give us the a sort of deeper knowledge of what might need to be done to address that, and the government is committed that it is going to regulate umbrella companies under the Labour Market Single Enforcement Body.
Thank you. I'm afraid I'm out of time. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Harriet. Kevin, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to deal with prosecutions. It follows on from some of Harriet's points. Prosecutions of tax fraud. Why are there so few and a reducing number of tax fraud prosecutions?
Yeah. So we are increasingly focusing our fraud investigations on the more complex and sophisticated frauds. We have a very wide range of civil powers that we do deploy to tackle fraud, but our prosecutions, we have a policy really of making sure that we use that in cases where there is no alternative means to tackle that particular fraud, where it is going to have a deterrent effect, or where it's a strategically important approach. We are increasing the number of investigations of the wealthiest and most sophisticated tax offenders. That has risen from around 50 in 2016-17 to around 430 as about March last year. So we are really trying to focus our efforts on really tackling the most egregious frauds using those criminal powers, or places where we can't go without the use of criminal powers in order to gather the evidence to settle that particular matter and to bring those to book who have been perpetrating fraud.
Okay. But you do accept there's a reducing number of cases. I think the first hearing at Magistrates' Courts in 2016 was 791. That's gradually reduced to 476. That was pre-pandemic. And I think...
Yes, and we are not pursuing a strategy of... So we do tackle fraud, a massive number of fraud cases each year. So last year, my Fraud Investigation Service tackled 8,200 civil cases alongside... launching 212 new criminal cases. But the criminal cases that we launch are reducing. They are complex. They are going to be amongst tackling the most severe harms. And we have a range of other powers that we use to tackle non-compliance, from things like taking proceeds of crime action, asset freezing orders. There's a whole range of powers that we deploy that are not just about criminal prosecution to bring people to book.
Your civil route, that's Code of Practice 9, is that right?
It's not just Code of Practice 9, but Code of Practice 9 is absolutely one of the ways in which we
that's reducing as well.
Tackle fraud.
So that was 549 cases in 2016, and it's gradually reducing to 425 cases pre-pandemic 2019.
Yes, and as I say, that is by far from being the only means we have for tackling fraud. So, that 8,200 cases that we've launched use a broad range of powers. We continue to bring in large sums of money for the Exchequer, as well as tackling really serious harms that range from serious and organised crime through to individuals defrauding the tax system in multiple ways, unfortunately.
You can understand the concern here. I mean, Code of Practice 9, I think somebody has to admit to tax fraud to be under that particular Code of Practice. So it's serious stuff under this. But the numbers seem to be reducing in terms of prosecutions and in terms of use of that civil course of action.
Everything our Fraud Investigation Service investigates is serious by its very definition. And as I say, what we're trying to do is use our powers to best effect to both bring in the proceeds of fraudulent activity into the Exchequer. And we brought in £3.5 billion in the last year that we reported in our annual report. And we will continue to focus on bringing in the proceeds of fraud. Yeah. There is absolutely no reduction in activity. We just try to use the powers that are most appropriate for the particular crime that we're all trying to tackle at that particular point.
I'm just worried about the focus and the message that sends. I think in your annual report you say our focus is maximising compliance and obviously then getting revenue back, rather than chasing arbitrary targets for arrests and prosecutions. And Jesse Norman, when he was financial Secretary of the Treasury, told an APVG seminar that HMS job is revenue collection, not to pursue long and expensive court action to collect money. But it doesn't send the wrong message to people. It's like saying to a burglar, well, you've stolen stuff out of that house, but give us it all back, maybe a little bit extra, and we'll let you carry on. Isn't that what we're saying to people?
Our powers are quite far-reaching, and certainly if people get caught, they give us a lot back. They will give us a lot back. They will not just give us a little bit extra back, they will give us a lot back.
How much? What's the penalty?
Well, double. And
is that typically what it's charged, double?
I can't actually give you the answer up front on that, but I would be happy to explore that one. But, we continue. We charge penalties, we take securities for potential fraud, we disqualify, work with the Insolvency Service to disqualify directors. There is a really large range of powers. We take asset freezing orders. We brought in more than half of the total UK money from the proceeds of crime powers last year as well. So I can assure you we're not leaving any stone unturned.
Okay, the trend doesn't look like that, but okay, let's...
So I think, if I could just say, though, it is important to make sure we land this. I mean, in the case of prosecutions, the reduction in prosecutions is the result of a deliberate decision by Hmrc that we would not do what we call sort of volume prosecutions of low-level fraud, that we would concentrate on that as a tool for tackling the most serious fraud. Now, we need to demonstrate that that is what we're actually doing. And so we measure, as the number of prosecutions go down, we have been measuring, as Penny said, first of all, the proportion of our criminal investigations that are on the wealthiest taxpayers, and you can see that the value of the money involved in our criminal cases has increased fivefold from 2016 to 2021.
Yeah, that completely. It's like saying, though, some crime isn't important. This is fraud, tax fraud. It's like saying, okay, we'll just go after white-collar criminals that are stealing loads of money, rather than saying low-level crime is also important.
I think, picking up what Penny said, criminal investigation and prosecution is only one of a number of tools that invest.
Yes, but the other tools are decreasing in volume too.
Well, we don't leave the rest unattended. We are all over it in terms of our fraud investigation service. But I think if we were to use the number of sort of criminal investigations and prosecutions as a measure of our success, that would not actually be an effective way of measuring it.
If somebody made a settlement with you under Code of Practice 9, and say they were a tax advisor or an accountant or something, because you can use that route, I think, for those people, would they be allowed to continue practising?
I would sincerely hope not. It would depend on their professional body, not on us. But
okay. Did you instruct the professional bodies to strike them off or something? Is that what happens?
We certainly share information with the professional bodies.
If we identify misconduct by a member of a professional body, we will share that information with the professional body and expect them then to follow their own misconduct proceedings against that person, which can result in them being struck off by the body. And we do obviously then liaise with the bodies to make sure both that the quality of the information that we are giving them is right from their point of view, and that from our point of view we can see effective action being taken.
Would you be able to tell us how many of the people you refer to the professional bodies have actually been struck off and how many haven't?
I'm not sure we would hold that information.
Okay.
But I can definitely go back and see.
The professional bodies chair that. I don't know if that's possible.
We can certainly look at that. We can certainly give you, we would have information about the number of referrals, for example.
We would, yeah.
Just talk about promoters. In terms, obviously, the loan charges brought this to prominence. You talked about the difficulty some of these people are in and were probably duped in many cases, and some have taken their own lives, which is catastrophic. Do you know how many people since 2016 have been convicted for crimes relating to promoting tax avoidance schemes involving disguised remuneration?
No, I have that number somewhere, but not offhand. So can I just... We need to be clear that promoting tax avoidance is not a criminal offence. There may be fraud associated with the promotion.
That's what Lucy Fraser said. Lucy Fraser, Financial Secretary, said in November 21, she said there are a range of offences which might be committed by those who promote tax avoidance schemes.
There might be a range of offences, yes, but it is not in of itself a criminal offence. And sorry, I don't know if we can find the number here. But
in terms of the numbers of people that have been convicted relating to promoting tax avoidance schemes which include disguised remuneration since 2016, would it surprise you if that figure was none?
Well, and what I would say to you is, as I say, the promotion of tax avoidance is not in itself a criminal offence.
Okay, if
there has been fraud associated with the promotion of tax avoidance, then we would see a criminal investigation in relation to that.
Since April 2016, I mean, you may be right about disguised remuneration, but since April 2016, more than 20 people have been convicted of offences relating to arrangements which have been promoted and marketed as tax avoidance, and they've received over 100 years of custodial sentences, and we've got more inquiries underway. So, we do use prosecution against promoters where there is criminality involved in their promotion of avoidance.
Isn't it cheating the public revenue? Isn't it that? That's an offence, isn't it? Isn't that what these people are doing? I mean, these people are effectively taking people's lives and destroying their lives. Isn't it worth taking some cases forward for promoters of disguised remuneration schemes to set the tone that this is not acceptable?
I can assure you, if we find the grounds to do so, we will do so. We are as outraged as you by the activities of promoters, but we are tackling them in the most effective ways that we can find, including strengthening the legislation that is both contained in this finance bill and was contained in the last Finance Act to help us to do that.
Right. I think I'm out of time, Chair, but it's a very interesting some kind of question.
Thank you. Rushanara.
Thank you and good afternoon. So my questions are about Northern Ireland border checks. Jim Hara, the government said that it would ensure HMRC is sufficiently resourced to deal with abusive customs arrangements in Northern Ireland. Have you got enough resources for that?
Yes, I believe I have. So, in the case of EU exit, as I think I probably have told this committee before, we have prioritised that. So in 2021, I effectively had three priorities. One was to deliver the COVID-19 support, and one was to deliver EU exit, and the third was to keep the essential parts of the tax system going. So it continues to be a priority for us, both in organisational focus and in the deployment of resources.
And what abuses of the regime have been prevalent so far?
I mean, I think very little, because the purpose of the Northern Ireland Protocol is to protect the EU single market whilst enabling goods to flow within the UK single market effectively. It is not a revenue-raising protocol. In fact, we expect there to be really no revenues involved in the movement of those goods. So it's not it's not an area that is sort of ripe with abuse. Our approach has been however, it is burdensome for businesses to comply with, and it can be disruptive to the economy. And so our focus has been really on helping businesses to sort of navigate their protocol obligations and to continue with their flow of trade. So, for example, through the Trader Support Service that the government funds, which both gives education and support to traders moving goods into Northern Ireland, but also actually makes the declarations on their behalf if that's what they want us to do. So, it's not an area of the code that I am, that I see as a high risk of abuse. I see it as a high risk of causing undue burden for businesses.
Okay, thank you. And our understanding is that businesses in Northern Ireland have to use two IT systems, the CDS system for movements from the rest of the world and the older Chief system for the rest of the UK. Can you just talk us through why that has to happen?
Okay, so first of all, the Chief system, which is our old customs system, is being phased out completely between now and 2023 for all businesses. Mm-hmm. In the case of Northern Ireland, the more modern customs declaration service is the one that needs to be used for the movement of goods where there could be a dual, an EU or a UK tariff, because it is the only system on which we can operate that, which is obviously a unique thing relating to the Northern Ireland Protocol. So that meant that traders moving goods into Northern Ireland that could be subject to that tariff had to make their declarations under CDS. For goods moving into Northern Ireland from the rest of the world, we did operate a sort of temporary easement whereby they could use Chief if they wished. We do know that at this stage some businesses cannot directly use CDS because they don't have the software that supports it, but the Trader Support Service can make the declaration onto the system for them if they wish, and the Trader Support Service has now been extended to cover sort of the rest of the world goods as well. So we do need businesses moving goods into Northern Ireland to use CDS because that's the only system that enables us to comply with our protocol obligations, but we've got that free service to enable them to do that, and in any event they are sort of getting ahead of the game that other traders are going to have to catch up with, because by 2023 we won't be using Chief anymore.
So what are the sort of pressures businesses are facing in using that system? How burdensome is it? How costly is it? And what sort of support are you providing them?
So I think the primary thing with CDS is that it's a new system. International traders have got very used to using Chief. It's been there since the mid-1990s. In a weird way, they love it because they're very familiar with it, and any change, of course, involves transitional cost for people. And in particular, they have to acquire new software that interfaces with CDS rather than Chief. And we've been working for a number of years now with the community system providers and software houses to make sure they've got the products ready for CDS. And we've had to accept that Chief would have a longer life than we originally anticipated, because EU exit meant that those organisations had to focus on something different. I think also declarations on CDS involve, it's not just different software, but they gather different data items, and therefore you have to re-engineer some of your business processes that gather the data that feeds into the declaration, as well as changing your software. On the other hand, it is a modern platform on which we will be able to make improvements in the future, in contrast with Chief, which was very stable but was very old and we could not really change, which is one of the reasons why we couldn't put the dual tariff on it. The government has invested in this spending review I think £180 million to enable us to make progress on implementing a single trade window for trade in the future as part of its border transformation strategy, and Hmrc will be delivering that on behalf of all government departments. And I think the fact that we are moving on to a more modern, flexible declaration service will help us to do that.
And has anyone done any assessments of what the cost burden is on businesses?
Yeah, I think I've given, I think I've spoken to the committee before about we have published a sort of impact assessment.
Just remind us, apologies, I can't remember the number.
So that was, I think, £7.5 billion sort of each way as the additional costs of the extra declarations that would have to be made as a result of EU exit. We have not since refreshed that assessment, so those remain the figures. However, our experience of the year since the transition period ended on the 31st of January last year is that the number of declarations that we have received is significantly lower than forecast, which would then mean, I think, that the admin burden increase would be lower as well. But obviously we've had a non-typical year of trading because of the pandemic, so I think it'll probably take us a bit longer to understand whether that is a real longer term decrease. I suspect it is because our assessment of the number of extra declarations we would receive was based on a model of how international trade would behave and the types of declarations they would make. You can see, I think, how traders between the UK and the EU, for example, have been changing the size of their consignments, for example, so I would expect the figures to be lower than that impact assessment when we revise them, but at this stage we haven't done so.
But 7.5 billion each way.
That was that impact assessment that we published, I think, in 2018, I think.
Yep. It would be helpful to get an update on what those changes might be.
We do obviously intend to do one in due course, but I don't think we feel that we have the data at this stage that would enable us to give a
When do you think you might be able to provide something up to date with the data, when you have the data?
I'm not sure what the plans are, but I think now that we have, I think two things have happened that mean that we should be able to collect more stable data. First of all, on the 1st of January this year, we implemented that sort of final phase of full import controls, or customs controls, and then secondly, trade appears to be sort of stabilising at a sort of I know we're not post-pandemic, but trade appears to have been coping with that and rationalised itself. So it may be that we'll have a better set of trade data going forward that has got less sort of interference from noise from other things.
Okay. And the Infrastructure and Projects Authority marked your CDS programme as and your Border Systems Transition Programme AMBER in July 2021, meaning there are significant issues. Is that still the case?
I think, in terms of the functionality of the system and its scaling, that is all in place, and we had to make changes to cope with the changes that were introduced on the 1st of January. So I think in terms of the system, that is much lower risk than it would have been then. However, in terms of the migration of traders onto it, that is still something that we have to achieve over the next, I think it's 15 or 16 months, and that that has taken longer and been disrupted by events compared with our original plans. And I don't have a crystal ball, but I'm hoping it'll be a smoother run over the next 15 months to get there. But that's the key challenge to us now, is the migration of traders.
Anyone else like to come in on any of those points?
My colleagues leave customs to me, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And Siobhan, please.
Thank you. I'd just like to look at the high income child benefit charge. And to you, Penny, why do you think so many people don't understand what they need to do when their or their partner's income exceeds the limits for child benefit?
Firstly, I'd say a huge number of people do know what to do. We have around 90% of people who pay the right amount of tax without prompting, and we work hard to make sure that people are brought up to speed on that as early as possible in the journey that they might go on for child benefit, including having amended the forms to make high income child benefits charge much more visible in the forms and the circumstances, therefore on people's minds as they fill it in. It is a population that is not necessarily used to being involved with Hmrc. They're largely middle and high income taxpayers who may not otherwise interact with us, and we work very hard to try to bring people into compliance as soon as we possibly can. For those who don't realise that they
write out to them and say
we do write out to. Over the last few years, we've written to between 70 and 90,000 letters to people to remind them of their obligations in relation to HICPIC. We can only do that where we have the data. And obviously we do not have data on household formation. So if people's details are not up to date with us, for instance, if we don't know that households have combined or split, then we may not be in a position to nudge people to be compliant. But it is a change we put in place from a sort of a different approach to compliance, which was more investigative in 2018. And I think, very much with the intention of trying to get people on the right track as early as possible and help them to comply with the charge.
So what proportion of people do you think you're not contacting to let them know?
It's very difficult to know what you don't know. We, as I say, we plumb our sources of data as much as we reasonably can. But the thing I cannot know about is household formation and changes to the household. So where that occurs, people sometimes will not be made aware by us in a proactive way. So we try as hard as we can to make it possible for people to comply with that easily in a straightforward way.
There do appear to be significant numbers of people who don't know, aren't contacted, and the first they hear of it is when they're asked for a large sum of back payment. Is that a system that really works?
So we obviously, as we nudge people, sometimes we come across people who have been out of the system for a period of time, and as we uncover, that process may uncover that they do owe us that charge for a previous set of periods, and that's really unfortunate. As I say, we try very hard. We have, worked with partners as well to publicise the conditions for high income child benefit charge as best we may, but unfortunately we do uncover people who have previous years owing. I can't say I have a silver bullet for that, because if I knew how to solve it, I'd solve it. And it does, as you say, it often tends, the cases I see that come across my desk perhaps are ones where people have seen a change in the household where that isn't something that perhaps has been evident, and we haven't been able to get to them as soon as we would like.
I've just got a number of quick questions just about the whole process, and that does Hmrc charge interest and penalties for failure to pay back child benefit?
If it's a prompted disclosure, then there would be a scale. There's a scale of penalties depending on whether or not people have come forward of their own volition, or whether or not we have nudged them, or whether or not they have not paid for a period of time in a knowing way. And interest, yes, is charged.
In what circumstances would you not charge interest or fine people?
We do charge interest because it is tax that, in truth, those individuals have had the benefit of while others have paid the tax that was owed. So these individuals have had the benefit of that tax in that period, while other people have been paying the tax that was due and should have been in the exchequer.
I think, to be clear, I mean, from our point of view, interest is not
not a choice.
It's not punitive, and we don't really have discretion to disapply it. It is, if you have had the enjoyment of money that should have been in the public purse, then you have to pay interest. Penalties, on the other hand, they do relate to culpability. So if someone's failure to pay their high income child benefit charge was not culpable, then there's no question of us charging them a penalty. But interest will apply just for any late payment, as a matter of course.
And how much do you think is outstanding that you're owed because people actually earn too much?
I don't think I have a figure for that, to my best knowledge. I don't think we have a specific tax gap for that tax. So the tax gap measures a whole bundle of taxes at quite a high level. I'm sorry, I just don't think we have a figure for that.
Have you ever considered an amnesty?
So I think, first of all, Hmrc tends not to have amnesties, but I think I can understand their value if there are people who have had a long pattern of non-compliance and we need to get them to sort of sort out their affairs and join the club. And certainly in areas like the hidden economy, we look at how we can incentivise people to do that. Here, I think we are more likely to be looking at a range of people whose behaviours range from they just haven't taken sufficient care with their tax affairs through to they just genuinely didn't realise that they were liable for this. And, I think asking them to just pay the tax that they should have paid if they had known, we regard as a reasonable thing to do. However, if they then get a bill that they find that they can't afford to pay off in one go, then like any other taxpayer, we will agree an affordable payment plan with them.
Have you estimated how many families will be brought within the high income charge because of fiscal drag?
Hmrc hasn't, I don't believe, no.
Could some of those people not be higher rate taxpayers?
Well, you have to be earning at least £50,000 to be liable for the high income child benefit charge, and by the time you get to £60,000 income, the charge is equivalent to the child benefit, so there's actually no advantage to you receiving child benefit if your income is over £60,000 because the charge will be equivalent to it.
How many people write to the Hmrc a year to ask for an assessment of their partner's claiming of child benefit or their partner's income?
I really don't have that number, I'm sorry.
Because isn't this really that tax is based on the individual, but child benefit and support of children is a whole household responsibility?
I mean, this is one of the challenges of both for us of administering this charge and for the taxpayers in terms of complying with their obligations, where the tax charge falls on the earner if they or their partner have been receiving the child benefit. So that is a complication from our point of view, because as you say, tax is an independent matter. We don't tax people on a household basis, but we are now looking at the circumstance of a partner of a taxpayer to determine that person's liability. So that is that's undoubtedly, the challenge that lies behind A, the level of non-compliance that we see, but also B, our difficulty in finding and communicating with the relevant people.
How many people are brought into self-assessment by the high income child benefit tax charge that otherwise might not have been?
I will check if this is incorrect, but from memory I think it's about 150,000 people have to complete a self-assessment return in order to return the child benefit charge, high income child benefit charge to us. In other words, they are people who otherwise we would not ask to complete a return. That's a figure that's in my head, but if it's wrong, I'll let you know.
And what would be the cost of that to HMRC?
The cost of administering a self-assessment return?
150,000 of them.
I mean, I suspect the marginal extra cost is virtually nothing.
Virtually nothing. But bearing in mind that more than 95% of the people who file a self-assessment do so digitally, in which case it's a hands-free activity for us.
Okay, and just my last question to you, Jim, is it fair for HMRC to rely on the government moving the goalposts after the recent court judgment about your pursuant of higher taxpayers' child benefit because you failed to run the scheme properly, as seems to be in a case?
Okay, so I think we'll find out probably after we leave here today whether indeed we have been given that power, because it's in the finance bill that's going through the House today. Yeah, so there was a case called Wilkes, which concluded that we did not have the power to use what we call discovery assessments to recover the tax that was due. So there was no dispute that the liability was due, but where a taxpayer does not return that on a self-assessment return, we use discovery assessments to assess them to the tax, and the court ruled that actually that piece of legislation does not apply to the high income child benefit charge. Now, we are appealing against that judgment, and I would hope that we will overturn it on appeal, but the reality is, in the meantime, there is uncertainty for people, and therefore the government concluded that they would legislate to put beyond doubt that discovery assessments do apply. Respectively. And also legislated to apply that retrospectively. The government's view is that that is fair, because otherwise people who had complied with their obligations would find themselves at a disadvantage compared with people who hadn't. But I recognise that any retrospective legislation is controversial, and it's not something that the government undertakes lightly, and I'm sure you can have differing views on that, but that was the view that the government took.
Okay, thank you. And I've got some... do you want to come in, actually? I've got some related questions about national insurance credits and the higher earners' child benefit. And the Office of Tax Simplification made recommendations about child benefit and the high income child benefit charge, including that the government should review the administrative arrangements for the charge. What are you doing about that?
Okay, so it is important that if someone is eligible for child benefit and could benefit from a national insurance credit, that they claim the child benefit, and they can, if they wish, claim the benefit but not receive it. So, for example, if you are the partner of someone who's earning over £60,000 a year and you would benefit from a national insurance credit, you can put in the claim, that gives you the credit. You can say, I don't wish to receive the benefit, and then that way your partner doesn't have to make one of those self-assessment returns to return the charge. So
that strikes me as a really complicated thing to work out.
I agree, people have to make the right choices. I mean, even before the high income child benefit charge came in, it was important in a couple that the person who could benefit from the national insurance credit was the person who made the claim. So there is some complexity for families here in terms of making sure they make the right choices, and it's our job to make sure that is communicated and as many people as possible are aware of that. But that is not, it is sort of, I guess, made a little bit more complex by the high income child benefit charge, but was already there as a sort of complexity before it.
And so, do you have any idea of the scale of people who are missing out on national insurance credits because of?
I mean, that's really difficult for us because it's trying to know something that we don't know. I mean, so first of all, a lot of people, would not benefit from the credit because they are working or they've got a full sort of contributions record. They'll get a full contributions record and be eligible for a full state pension in any event. But there are other people for whom it will be important, but I can't put a number on it, I'm afraid.
Thank you. And if we could just look at grandparents. Because as you know, grandparents may also benefit from national insurance credits arising from child benefit if nominated to do so, because they're caring for a child part-time, but the parent is already paying national insurance. To what extent do you think the particular benefit is underclaimed?
I don't have information that I will check after this whether we've got that information. But you are right. I mean, there can be several people who are eligible to receive child benefit in respect of a child. Only one of them can claim it, and it's important that that the right person in that group claims it to who would benefit from the national insurance credit.
Thank you.
Thanks, Siobhan. A quick technical question, Jim. You may not know the answer to this. In terms of somebody falling due to pay their high-income child benefit charge by virtue of their partner earning 50,000 plus, how do you define partner in that sense, and how do you define them both as forming part of the same household? You know that?
I don't know off the top of my head, I'm sorry.
We'll add that to the letter of questions. I'll just be quite intrigued. Alison, sorry, on that point maybe.
Yeah, just a quick supplementary on this. Could you tell me a wee bit more about how you approach domestic abuse, financial abuse and coercive control with relation to the high income child benefit charge? If one partner will not tell the other what their income is, for example.
And again, I think I'm going to have to write to you on that one. So I'm sure that we will thoroughly investigate the circumstances of those kinds of situations, but I can't in honesty tell you the answer here today, so let me get back in touch with you.
It was just in relation to the point about penalties as well, if that might be a situation
absolutely.
where a penalty may not be levied.
Yeah, let me get back to you on that.
Thank you. Finally, Anthony, please.
Thank you, Chair. I've got questions about research and development tax credits, and then a couple of questions about probate and inheritance tax. My first question on R&D tax credits is, I think it should be aimed at Jim. Your accounts were qualified by the Auditor General because of error and fraud in research and development tax credits. Why is there such a problem with research and development tax credits that leads to your accounts being qualified?
I think so. R&D tax credits are one of a range of tax reliefs, but they are quite different from most tax reliefs in that they can result in a payment out to the claimant as opposed to a reduction, just a reduction in their tax bill. So they're, I think probably from an auditor's point of view, they're quite special in that way because some of them involve expenditure.
Sometimes the relief is higher than what they're spending.
Yes. So the nature of the relief, the incentive is that in some cases you will make a payment, and it's a payment of public expenditure rather than a tax relief. There has been concern about the potential level of error and fraud in R&D over the years. This scheme has become more and more generous, and we have seen changes in the behaviour in the market, which Penny might be able to talk to you more about in terms of sort of boutique firms sort of generating claims for taxpayers and really pushing at the boundaries of R&D. And so in the last budget, for example, the government announced a set of measures intended to reduce that. Some of them are policy changes to how much relief people can qualify for, but some of them are administrative changes to help Hmrc to police the system. So, for example, just cover a couple of the administrative changes. In the future, you will have to notify us in advance. A company will need to notify us in advance if they are going to make the claim, and they will have to have a nominated person in the business who is accountable for the accuracy of the claim, and they will have to tell us the name of any firm that they have used to advise them in compiling the claim, and that will help us to risk assess cases because we know how some firms behave in that market. But if I'll give you an example of why we're introducing those changes, we have seen cases where an advisor has come in, helped a company to make a claim. We go in afterwards to investigate, and actually no one in the company has any idea how the claim was compiled, because they just relied on the advisor. And so we were concerned that means that officers of companies are not taking the care that they should take. But in addition to that, there are policy measures being brought into being looked at to really target the relief more effectively at achieving its policy objectives, as well as protecting us from error and fraud.
Yes, and I think Jim's given a very comprehensive answer there. So we do see agent behaviours we would sooner rather not see. We're working with the professional bodies as part of our work to tackle that. We're also looking at making sure we both educate people on what the purpose of the relief is and what a legitimate claim looks like, but also those measures that Jim described are designed to give us much more information to be able to risk the claims that come in more effectively. So, enabling us to have a digital kind of footprint for those claims will help us to do that more swiftly. And as Jim says, people taking more ownership of those claims within the organisation will make sure that there's a better kind of oversight of those within the organisations that are doing the claiming. The number of claims has risen quite considerably in the last few years, and in response to that, obviously we've had to increase the resources, and we'll continue to look at increasing the resources in the compliance directorates responsible for tackling those particular sort of misuses, I guess, of the R&D tax credit.
I would just add, whilst it's important that we focus on error and fraud and driving it out of the scheme, it is 3.6% of the claims, and what we have to find is a way of tackling that is proportionate in terms of its impact on the vast majority of legitimate claimants, because this is a very important incentive in the economy that we need to make as easy and fast to claim by legitimate claimants as possible, whilst protecting ourselves from what looks like a growth in abuse of the scheme. I should add that we're also, which is very unusual for one particular aspect of the tax system, carrying out a random inquiry programme into R&D credit so that we get a more defined estimate of the error and fraud and better insights into the behaviours that are driving it.
How much you called it abuse of the system, which is a good catch-all. Do you know how much is actually deliberate fraud and how much is error? And presumably that error would be because people don't quite understand what qualifying research and development is and what isn't, and they're not quite sure and they stick it in.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't characterise much of what we see here as error. I think there's a combination of what I would call boundary pushing and fraud. So boundary pushing is, we get advisors who are constantly testing the definition of research and development and trying, and so
it's normally for plant and equipment and stuff, isn't it?
It can be for a whole anything. It can be for a whole range of activities. It can be software development, it can be product and packaging development, a whole range of things. But so we have to deploy quite a bit of resource, quite apart from trying to prevent fraudulent claims, but also sort of protecting the definition of the relief.
Pushing back on the boundary.
And making sure that it stays targeted on those activities which we are actually trying to incentivise. Yeah. It is in the nature of tax reliefs that try to incentivise behaviours that people would not otherwise undertake, that they want the tax relief, but they don't want to undertake the behaviour that they wouldn't otherwise undertake. So, R&D relief is not, it's not unusual in that. Other tax reliefs that are designed to sort of address market failures or incentivise people to spend money on things they would otherwise not have spent it on meet similar challenges.
Yeah. Do you, I think it's 0.25% of GDP is spent on tax credits. As you said, it's a large amount of money, and but actually the UK doesn't have a very good, particularly good track record by international comparisons on research and development. And so there's been some debate about how effective these tax credits are. That's a really sort of big debate and service-based economy and all sorts of things. But I was just wondering, from your sort of frontline experience, whether there's changes you think that could be made to the tax credit system to make it more likely to target the sort of behaviours that you were talking about just now. Yeah, and do you get consulted by the Treasury on the design of it? Because it's very granular, those incentives.
Yes. First of all, we definitely do. So we're in a policy partnership with the Treasury, and in the case of R&D in particular, it's a good example of how there is both from a Treasury perspective an interest in making sure that this actually achieves the changes in the economy that we want, but from an HMRC perspective, obviously also an aim to make sure that people are compliant and that it is going to people who qualify for it, and that is also achieving that effect. And there's a good exchange of information between the departments to enable Treasury to make best calls about the targeting, but also for us to identify the kinds of administrative measures that can make a difference. So if I pick up, for example, the advanced notification point, I think it is arguable that if an advisor goes into a company and says, this expenditure you've had for the last 4 years, well, actually, I could put in an R&D claim for that. Well, that relief has not incentivised that behaviour.
It's dead weight.
It's a dead weight cost. So, so I think we are increasingly identifying, as the scheme has become more generous, I think we're increasingly identifying ways of protecting the boundaries of it and the targeting of it.
As I said, another question about probate. In fact, my mother died last year, so I've got first-hand experience of this in terms of inheritance tax and getting grant of probate. And there seems to be a catch-22 that you can only get the grant of probate if you're selling a house, which often happens after the death in the family. You can only get probate if you've paid inheritance tax, but you can only pay the inheritance tax once you've sold the house. So you're in this catch-22 that you can't sell the house without paying inheritance tax, and you can't pay inheritance tax without selling the house. Now, obviously, there's workarounds to that. I think people can get loans from Hmrc to effectively and pay interest on it in order to pay the inheritance tax before selling the house, or you can try and persuade a bank to give you a loan for the inheritance tax, an unsecured loan that would be very expensive. I was just wondering how much, and I certainly know amongst various advisors on this, they think it is a sort of rather complex roundabout system. Whether it be whether you've thought about easier ways of doing it. For example, that the payment of inheritance tax happens at the moment of completion in the same way that payment of stamp duty does.
Will I pick this up?
Yeah, go on.
Okay. So yes, I recognise that it is a complexity. There is there's a long-standing rule in inheritance tax that you must estimate and pay the inheritance tax at a certain point, regardless of whether you've actually sort of completed the estate and realised the assets. I don't think we make loans, but I think what we do is allow people to
payments and pay
interest
in practical sense.
And I think we should be constantly looking at whether we can improve that. But I don't think we are looking at that more fundamental option of changing the timing of payment of IHT. I think it's a pretty fundamental part of the design that it has to be estimated.
It's not a question about the timing. So the payment of IHT is within 6 months of death, and it's not a question about that. It's a question about the sequencing of paying IHT and getting the grant of probate and being able to sell the house that causes the complications. So it's not, obviously you have to have a cut-off date for inheritance tax, and 6 months sounds perfectly reasonable, and obviously you need to get inheritance tax before you allow people to sell a house. I totally get that. But you could do it at the moment of completion, so that when the conveyancers they get the sum of money from the sale of the house, and some of it they give to probably give to you. Is it stamp duty? Do you collect stamp duty? They give stamp duty. Some of it they pay fees to the conveyancers, and they pay the estate agents, and also pay the inheritance tax at the same time. And then you'd stop this roundabout money go round, which causes a lot of people real confusion at a time of great vulnerability.
Well, I think we'll bear in mind the suggestion. I think we are well aware of the difficulty of doing this, and I will take account of the suggestion.
It could be simplified quite radically, and it would help a lot of people at a time of vulnerability. Thank you.
Anthony, thank you. That concludes this session. You may be pleased to know, but can I thank you, all three of you, for coming and appearing before us. I think it's been a very useful conversation. You very kindly agreed to write to us on certain matters, and probably best handled by me writing to you in the first instance, with setting out those questions and perhaps one or two others. And can I also thank you and your colleagues in Hmrc for all the hard work that you do. Nobody thinks you're perfect, you're well aware of that, but at the same time, that's not the same thing as saying that we shouldn't recognise that particularly during the pandemic, a lot of very good work was carried out under extreme conditions, and for that I think this committee is grateful. That concludes this.
On to my colleagues.
Thank you. That concludes this session. Order. Order. Thank you.